Let me ask Dambisa, you to respond, because in your book you've made a somewhat controversial recommendation to turn the aid tap off, and to do that relatively quickly. So how do you respond to Stephen's comment here that this is a long transition, and in a sense it seems there's a risk of shock therapy here? How do you make that transition?
First of all, I've been misquoted. I never said we should switch off the taps immediately. What I have said is we should be discussing an exit strategy, and we should be aspiring to a time when African governments can start to be weaned off of aid. I think the fundamental problem with the aid system is that it's all couched in negatives. And if you actually listen to what Stephen Lewis has just said, it's littered with negatives. It's the poor Africans with HIV. It's the poor woman who's getting raped. It's the tragedy. I'm here to tell you that there is good news, and we're trying to focus on that good news to significantly transform our continent. Let me share with you a few things. First of all, there are now 16 countries in Africa that have credit ratings, significantly B-, above B-, which people in here who know anything about the markets will know is not a bad rating. It's the rating of a Turkey. I do not believe that, not a Turkey, it is a rating of Turkey. I do not believe that many African governments will have chosen to take those ratings if they thought that they were going to be worse. We know that Turkey, like many other single B countries around the world, has come to the capital markets. The question is, why are African countries not even exploring that as an option? They should be. Second thing is, over 60% of the African population is under the age of 24. This is a young, vibrant, energetic population that desperately wants to be part of the Twitter and Facebook era. I get messages all the time from people in Africa who I know are struggling and using their last dime to go and send me an email because they're so interested in being part of a global community, but are constantly getting shut out because we prefer to hear from the celebrities. The IMF currently is forecasting that Africa is going to grow by 3% this year, sub-Saharan African growth. 3%, at a time when, as I said earlier, Germany is talking about contracting 6%. We're seeing 10% unemployment perhaps in the US. We're seeing global growth perhaps at 0.5. So it's not such a bad story. Some people might not even know in this audience that there are 15 stock markets in Africa right now. Over 85% of the stocks that trade on African stock markets are non-commodities. I say that again. Over 85% of the stocks that trade in Africa are non-commodity stocks. So this whole notion that Africa is one big commodity play, I think is again misleading. There are telecommunication stocks, consumer goods stocks, real estate stocks. The story is there. It's just about changing our mindset. It is not the end of the world. We need to encourage people to speak positively about the continent. Otherwise, how do you expect us to raise young people on a continent where we're constantly being told that they can't do it, they're too poor, they need aid?
Let me stop you there just because I want to bring Hernando into the conversation.
Sure.
Hernando, I want to ask you a similar question that I asked Stephen, allow you in a sense to rebut anything that you've heard from the other side so far this evening. But I'd like you to focus on a single proposition or idea that Stephen or Paul has put forward that you take exception to, and explain to us why.
Sure. So start off with listening to Paul. He talks as if capital were something you had and we didn't have, as if it were money. In terms of money, there's only $13 trillion worth of currencies in the world. Dollars, euros, Swiss francs, whatever you have. There's 13 trillion. Where does credit come from and capital come from? It's in the form of a lot of paper that's got equity, that's called equity. You call it bonds, you call it derivatives, you call it financial instruments. That isn't currency. It isn't money. It is paper that is essentially, as you will have learned through the recession, backed by assets. What does it mean, backed by asset? Or when you hear that the problem of derivatives in the United States is the underlying assets, it means that what really supports that paper is not the currency. What supports that paper is the asset. Homes, land, airplanes. It's all recorded, it's all registered. What happens in developing countries such as mine, or in developing countries such as Dambisa's? The assets aren't titled. They're not on paper. They cannot be converted into capital. As a result of which, what you have done, which is what I tried to illustrate, is that you have created capital by paperizing first. your rights in your concessions in developing countries by getting it guaranteed through bilateral investment treaties, a series of propositions, and then you've monetized it. Your central bank has issued currency to then symbolize that capital. So it isn't that we don't have capital. We have capital, but it's dead because it isn't paperized. Having said that, which is important to understand, you don't have to travel to Zambia to know what I'm talking about. You don't have to travel to Peru. Go see your own Indian reservations. That's dead capital. You've got people there who own a whole bunch of things, but not with the same instruments. They're frozen into an Indian Act of 1870 where they can't transfer these resources around. So they've got dead capital, but it can't become live because your guilt, sure, you did terrible things to them. But because you think you did it through property mechanisms, you've deprived it of them. You didn't deprive them through property mechanisms. You deprived them through taking away their sovereignty. It's a second thing, sovereignty. Sovereignty is the Palestinians versus Israelis. That's about borders. What you do there is you settle it. You say once and for all, this is Watutsi territory. This is what Aztec territory. This is Blackfoot territory. When you touch sovereignty, people don't like it. So if you go in, and which I know you've tried to do, and say, look, we want to assimilate you, they've resisted. They said, we don't want to be assimilated. We have our own pride, our own identity. What you should have told them is you have your pride and your identity, your sovereignty. What we're going to give you is property so that inside your sovereignty, you can convert your assets into capital. And what I'm trying to say is that though I appreciate aid enormously, I mean, what can you say about people who are so generous to developing countries that aren't even their own? Of course it's a good stuff. But what I'm also trying to tell you is that in that package, because you haven't actually been able to single out sovereignty from property, because you can't even understand it in your home territory, because Europeans can't understand it even in the case of Africa, your systems of aid, the officials, don't have sense given to creating property conditions in countries like mine. They even campaign against it. You give an enormous amount of money to maintaining tribes, clans. We all come from this, Asterix and Obelix, we all come from tribes. But on top of the tribe, you've given yourself commercial organizations. You've done nothing to help that. You even try and stop it, and you finance political versus commercial organizations. And that's what I'm objecting to. Not aid, but the fact that you haven't sorted out the difference between property and sovereignty on the one hand, and second, that you keep on thinking that capital comes from your money when it really comes from our property. And the day you figure out how you got developed by giving yourselves property rights, and how without any assistance in North America you developed without foreign assistance because you were able to put your assets into paper, we'll all be in agreement.
Well, let me turn to